The story starts on the rooftop of a building where a boy was proposing to a girl down on one knee, telling her that he liked her and asking if she would go out with him. He was none other than a second-year high school student named Haruchika Isezaki. With his head hung low, he thought about how far he had come and how hard he had worked for this moment. His hand was extended toward the girl, his heart thumping loudly in his chest. A few moments passed, but nothing happened. Slowly, he began to lift his head, only to be completely shocked by the view before him. One moment he was on the rooftop, and the next, he was in a vast, open field with wind rushing all around him. He couldn't believe his eyes and tried to stand on his wobbling legs. Unable to grasp what was happening, he began calling the girl's name, turning around and yelling in confusion. The grass rustled beneath his feet, but there was no trace of her. While he was still searching, someone appeared behind him and welcomed him. He turned to see a woman standing there, accompanied by a small fairy. The fairy, strangely enough, could read minds and communicate without ever opening her mouth. The woman smiled at him and asked if he was Haruchika Isezaki. Shuddering, he demanded to know who she was. She introduced herself as the goddess of Clemontine. Haruchika was stunned by her words. The goddess explained that she had a favor to ask of him and that refusing was not an option, so she asked him to be understanding. Haruchika was shocked and angry. He asked her if she was the reason he was there, and she confirmed it. He then asked if they were the ones who brought him to this place, and again, she nodded. His mouth twitched with frustration, and he yelled at her for dragging him away when he had been in the middle of a once-in-a-lifetime confession. The goddess replied bluntly that she didn't care, as such matters were not her concern. This only made Haruchika more furious. The goddess asked him to calm down and assured him that she would send him back as long as he listened to her request. The little fairy also urged him to stay calm. Still confused, Haruchika asked if she could really send him back to the exact moment he was confessing. She said yes, but he couldn't bring himself to believe her. The goddess remarked that doubting a god was blasphemous. Haruchika stared at them and finally let out a sigh. He asked what exactly they wanted him to do. Opening her arms, the goddess told him that she wanted him to save the world. Haruchika shouted in disbelief, saying that it was an outrageous demand. The goddess turned to the little fairy for confirmation and clarified that they weren't asking him to defeat the Demon King or anything like that because the Demon King had already been defeated just last week. Haruchika was stunned to hear how recent it was. The goddess then mentioned that the Demon King would revive again in 30 years, and the little fairy quietly confirmed it. Now even more shocked, Haruchika stared in disbelief. The goddess sighed and said the next generation of heroes was scheduled to defeat the Demon King again. But before she could finish, the fairy quickly interrupted her. She reminded the goddess that she wasn't supposed to phrase it that way because it was supposed to be destiny or fate. The goddess nodded in understanding and began explaining the situation to Haruchika in a calmer tone. She told him that during his final moments, the Demon King had cast a terrible curse or something of that sort. Haruchika was confused by what she meant and began to feel as if it was some endless, cruel game. The goddess shrugged casually and said it was really just a petty act of spite against her and called it childish. The fairy glanced at the goddess, thinking that the Demon King had been revived and defeated hundreds of times, but she chose not to say anything as she couldn't fully understand such sentiment. Haruchika, still overwhelmed, asked what any of this had to do with him. The goddess began to explain that the curse cast by the Demon King had stolen the ability to fall in love from 7 specific girls who were meant to become the mothers of the next generation of the hero party, the very ones destined to defeat the Demon King 30 years from now. Haruchika stared at her, completely dumbfounded, which only served to irritate the goddess. She snapped at him, asking what that look on his face was supposed to mean or if he was mocking her. She began yelling, emphasizing that without love, there would be no marriage, and without marriage, the next generation of heroes would never be born. The little fairy quickly flew up to the goddess and gently urged her to calm down. Regaining her composure, the goddess turned back to Haruchika and declared that she had summoned him, Haruchika Isezaki, from another world to restore the girl's ability to love. She claimed that he was the ultimate sage of romance, an expert in love, and even called him the Love Master. Haruchika was stunned and asked if they were seriously referring to him. He cringed at the embarrassing title and questioned why he was even involved in something like this, calling it the worst kind of situation to be dragged into. The goddess turned to the fairy, Jibril, and demanded to know if she was absolutely sure about Haruchika being the right person because she couldn't see even a trace of any love master aura around him. She also questioned who in their right mind would fall for someone as unreliable as him. Jibril ranted in defense, reminding her that she was the one who insisted Haruchika was the right choice. Haruchika, annoyed by their back and forth, tightened his tie and called the goddess useless, which made her visibly furious. He admitted that he had mastered all kinds of knowledge about romance, but commented that someone like her seemed like she'd be a real challenge to win over. The goddess gave him a strange look. Noticing her expression, Haruchika remarked that beautiful women were generally easier to charm. Her mouth twitched at his boldness, and she asked what exactly he meant by that. Shoving him slightly, the goddess accused him of acting like he could actually charm her if given the chance. Haruchika crossed his arms and replied that it wasn't something he could just say out loud, then turned to Jibril for confirmation. Jolted by his sudden involvement, the fairy quickly asked him not to drag her into this. The goddess pointed a finger at him, accusing him of speaking as if he had what it took to actually charm her. Smirking, Haruchika stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He stared straight into her eyes. The goddess began to protest, saying he was too close. But before she could finish her sentence, Haruchika pulled her gently by the waist. She complained that he was being rude and asked him to let go, but he continued to hold her gaze. Flustered, she averted her eyes and told him not to look at her like that, adding that she wasn't some kind of beauty. Haruchika closed his eyes for a moment and calmly agreed, which made the goddess glance up at him in surprise. He then opened his eyes and said that while beautiful women were easy to charm, she was too beautiful. His words caught her off guard and left her completely mesmerized, her heart pounding loudly in her chest. Haruchika turned his gaze away briefly, then gently held her by the shoulder. Looking into her eyes, he asked if she still wouldn't accept him. The goddess tried to speak but couldn't find the words. Under the weight of his stare, she stumbled over her thoughts and eventually slumped to the ground, completely overwhelmed. Haruchika smirked while the little fairy watched in amazement. She exclaimed that it was incredible to have that kind of effect on the goddess herself and asked what exactly he had done. Haruchika replied that it wasn't anything special, just a simple trick of the mind. She was surprised, and he went on to explain that humans have a natural sense of appropriate distance based on their relationship with others. He told her that if some random uncle got as close to her as a lover would, she would naturally feel disgusted. The fairy responded that disgust was putting it lightly because that kind of thing would be outright criminal. Haruchika agreed, saying she was absolutely right, and that was precisely why he had provoked the goddess. By doing so, he made her approach him on her own and then used her momentum to cross into her personal space. He thought that if he had stopped there, she would have simply felt uncomfortable, like he was just some intruder. Haruchika then loudly commented that the most important part was how he had locked eyes with the goddess and perfectly matched his breathing with hers. The little fairy seemed amused by this revelation. Haruchika explained that the act of gazing into each other's eyes was something only lovers did, and when lovers were together, their breathing naturally synchronized. He confessed that he had intentionally recreated that physical state between lovers, tricking her body into recognizing him as her partner. The little fairy asked if it was really possible to do something like that. Haruchika told her that it wasn't easy, and the technique to instantly match someone's breathing required intense training. Once the body was fooled, the heart rate increased and the brain released chemicals like phenylethylamine, estrogen, and endorphins that promote romantic feelings. At that point, his words would sound like a lover's whisper, and if he spoke in a deep voice close to her ear, making her feel his presence, resisting would become nearly impossible. Haruchika thought to himself that if things didn't work out with the goddess, he could just go home, but she had turned out to be far too easy. The little fairy stared at him in amazement and realized that he truly was a love master. Haruchika then asked if he would be allowed to return home if he pulled off the same thing with the 7 girls she had mentioned earlier. He blamed himself for throwing everything away just to master such a technique. The goddess, holding her heart, promised that she would send him back. Haruchika clenched his hands and thought about how everything he had done was for that single confession. All that remained was to hear her answer, and he had come this far and he would return to her side no matter what. He agreed to the goddess's request and extended his hand to her. She squeezed it and slowly stood up, saying that after being so rude to her, she wouldn't let him say he couldn't do it. He grinned and replied that he had no intention of saying such a thing. The goddess straightened up and announced that it was time to get back on track. Raising her hand, she startled the little fairy, who flinched at the sudden movement. The goddess told Haruchika that if he truly wanted to return, he would have to restore the ability to love in the hearts of those 7 girls, and he couldn't come back until all of them had fallen in love with him. Haruchika quietly wondered if he could really return at all. The goddess finally let out a sigh of relief and smiled. She announced that now that the little talk was over, she would be heading back. She also informed the little fairy, Jibril, that from now on she was in charge. Before Jibril could object, the goddess disappeared with a gust of wind. She wobbled in the air and muttered that the goddess was always like that. Turning to Haruchika, she apologized on her behalf. Haruchika was surprised and thought that Jibril had it rough too. Jibril grabbed his hand and told him that she would be his support, and he could leave everything to her. Growing irritated, he asked her to stop calling him Love Master. Amused, she asked if she could call him just Master instead. He reluctantly agreed and asked her to let go of his hand. Haruchika then asked what he was supposed to do now. Jibril smiled and conjured a spell with her hands, saying she would take him to the location of his first target. The ground beneath them opened, and Haruchika began floating in the air. Jibril assured him that he wouldn't fall, and there was nothing to worry about. She informed him that the first girl was a student at the Night Academy in Melkul, the royal capital of the Filio Kingdom. Haruchika was taken aback by this revelation. Jibril pointed toward the academy from their position in the sky so he could see it for himself. He gazed at it and thought that, with goddesses and angels already involved, this was starting to feel more and more like a fantasy. Jibril explained that the first girl was the youngest daughter of a militant noble family that ruled a border territory near the Demon King's domain, a clan of warriors who hunted monsters as part of their daily routine. Haruchika was stunned and asked if this wasn't supposed to be a simple love story. Jibril paused at his comment but eventually shrugged it off. She informed him that she had already taken care of his transfer into the academy and that he would be enrolled as an exchange student from a neighboring country. She had even arranged for him to be in the same class as the target, sitting right next to her. Haruchika stopped her and complained that he had no idea about the common sense or customs of this world. Jibril reassured him, saying he could leave everything to her. She added that only he could see her, and she would always be by his side to support him. Haruchika gritted his teeth and wondered if this was really going to be okay. Meanwhile, Jibril seemed to be pondering something. After a moment, she asked him why he had used such a straightforward approach with the girl on the rooftop when his love technique with the goddess had been so incredible. Haruchika was surprised by her question and asked if she had been watching them. Jibril sheepishly apologized. To break the awkward silence, she grabbed him by the collar from behind and said they needed to get down now, excusing herself for touching him. Haruchika mumbled something about his first love, though Jibril couldn't quite catch what he said. They finally landed on the ground. Peeking from behind a corner, Jibril pointed toward the arena and informed him that one of the girls fighting there was his first target. A huge crowd was cheering as the battle unfolded. A girl was facing off against a large man who tried to strike her with a sword, but she easily deflected the blow. Taking advantage of the moment, she pinned his sword to the ground with her leg and pointed her own blade at him, grinning in victory. Jibril told Haruchika that this girl was his first target named Lady Marion Bonnet. The next morning, the teacher entered the classroom and announced the arrival of a transfer student. A wave of murmurs spread through the room as the students began gossiping about someone transferring at such an unusual time of year. Haruchika Isezaki stepped into the classroom, and the teacher introduced him, stating that he would be studying with them from that day forward. Haruchika introduced himself, explaining that he had transferred due to certain circumstances and asked for everyone's kindness and support. The girls in the class whispered among themselves, impressed by his calm demeanor and elegant manners. Some even speculated whether he might be a royal in disguise. Haruchika smiled to himself, thinking about how important first impressions were. He had perfected the art of creating the image he wanted to project using a gentle smile, a low voice, and slow, clear speech with well-paced sentences. He believed that this combination would present him as a good-natured, refined, and intelligent individual. The teacher scanned the room, searching for someone, but seemed unable to spot her. Finally, he called out the name Marion Bonnet and asked her to raise her hand. When she did, he instructed Haruchika to take the seat next to her. As he approached her desk, Marion greeted him with a friendly smile. Haruchika had been expecting a rough, warrior-like presence, but was pleasantly surprised to find that she was simply a cute girl. Thanks to the appraisal skill Jibril had given him, he could see information about her age, occupation, skills, and most importantly, her romance value. Seeing that her romance value was at 0, he realized he would need to gradually increase it and decided to give things a gentle nudge during the next break. When class finally ended and the teacher exited the room, Marion stood up to leave. Haruchika took the opportunity to compliment her weapon. Marion's eyes lit up with excitement, and she asked if he could really tell anything about it. She proudly pulled out her sword and explained that she had designed it from scratch and had it forged by the best blacksmith in her territory. It wasn't just about the design, but its sharpness and balance were exceptional as well. Haruchika clapped his hands in admiration and commented that anyone capable of handling such a weapon must be very strong. Marion looked pleased and admitted she was quite strong to some extent. Without hesitation, she told him to call her just Marion and gave him a hearty slap on the back, saying she would call him Haruchika in return. He told her that he had watched her during the match the day before. He believed that the best way to grow close to someone was to highlight their strengths, ask about the things they were proud of, agree enthusiastically, and offer genuine praise because those small actions would naturally raise their affection. Marion blushed and asked if he had really been watching her, admitting that it was a little embarrassing. Jibril, observing from nearby, was impressed and thought that this was exactly what one would expect from a romance expert. Later during lunch, Haruchika slammed his fists onto the table in frustration. He was annoyed that the romance value hadn't increased at all. Despite Marion's positive reaction, he felt like he was only a step or two away from success, yet the score remained stagnant. Jibril urged him to calm down, reminding him that it was only the first day. He turned toward her with visible irritation, muttering that he was losing his mind. Jibril quickly corrected him, saying that he couldn't abbreviate things that way or people would start complaining. He snapped back, telling her to be quiet, and began questioning whether the numbers even moved at all. Jibril noticed that he was showing his true colors now that the classroom was empty. She admitted that, normally, the romance score should have gone up, but since this was the first time something like this had happened, she couldn't say for sure. Haruchika slammed his hands on the table once again and stood up to leave. Jibril followed behind, asking where he was going. Gritting his teeth, he replied that if the conditions weren't clear, then there was no way to figure things out. He began to wonder if Marion was simply a special case. So, to test it, he decided to try the technique on another girl. As they walked, he spotted a girl passing by and decided to make his move. Jibril saw her too and immediately noted that the girl had quite an intimidating presence. The girl noticed Haruchika staring and turned around to confront him, asking what he was looking at. The next morning, the girl Haruchika had approached was blushing and calling out to him. Her romance value had reached 100. Along with her, the other girls were also charmed by Haruchika's presence and demeanor. Haruchika grinned and waved casually at them, watching as the girls reacted with excitement. All of their romance values had reached 100, confirming what he had suspected about Marion was the only abnormal one. So this, he thought, was what it truly meant to steal someone's heart. His mind drifted back to the previous afternoon, reflecting on how he had tested different interactions with each girl he had the chance to meet. All of them had responded just as expected, their affection rising easily, perhaps too easily, since they weren't jaded or guarded. They were simple to win over. His thoughts were interrupted when Marion entered the classroom and took her seat beside him. She commented with a teasing smile that he had become quite the popular one. He glanced at her and replied that everyone was so friendly and that it had been a big help. But inwardly, he admitted to himself that she was the one he truly wanted to grow closer to. As if sensing his thoughts, Marion looked at him and reflected that she too wanted them to become closer friends. Suddenly, she burst out laughing and asked if people often told him his smile seemed fake. Haruchika stared at her, unfazed. Marion looked amused at his neutral expression, noting that he didn't even flinch. Jibril, watching from the sidelines, urged him to give her some kind of reaction, but all Haruchika could manage was a calm remark that a friend had once said the same thing about his smile. Marion realized that all her attempts to provoke him had failed completely. She would need to find some opening if she wanted to turn the tables. Before long, they found themselves at the training grounds. Haruchika stood with the support of a sword, lost in his thoughts and unsure of what he was supposed to do there. Marion approached and warned him that if he stayed distracted during sword training, he could get seriously hurt. Snapping out of his daze, he apologized. As Marion and another student sparred, he observed them carefully. It quickly became clear that he was nowhere near their level. Even Marion was in a different league altogether. Still, he raised his sword, deciding to at least imitate what he saw and try to learn. Marion glanced at him and couldn't help but comment on his awkward stance, declaring him a total amateur. He denied it, but she kept repeating her assessment. Before he could fully understand the situation, Marion surprised him by pointing her sword directly at him, catching him off guard. He froze, unable to move. In his mind, he reminded himself that he had completely remodeled his body to be more attractive, and he was confident in his physical abilities. Yet in that moment, he couldn't respond at all. Marion smiled knowingly and remarked that there was no way a complete amateur like him could have passed the transfer exam for a night academy without some kind of secret. Before Haruchika could reply, a loud thud echoed behind him. He turned to see 5 men lying unconscious on the ground. Shocked, he realized that the fight had been 5 against 1. Marion, standing beside him, commented that it was the only way it could even be considered a fair fight. A towering figure stood above the fallen men. Haruchika swallowed nervously as Marion identified him as Dean McAllister, said to be the strongest in the night class. One of the fallen men attempted to attack Dean again, but was effortlessly slammed to the ground in the blink of an eye. Dean approached and told him that his performance was a disgrace to the capital's night academy. Haruchika, Marion, and Jibril all watched him with a mixture of awe and amusement. Haruchika realized that Dean wasn't just strong, rather he operated on an entirely different level. Dean turned and noticed the group watching him. He walked over and stood directly in front of Marion. Locking eyes with her, he asked if it was time for her to accept her fate. He then added that she should be grateful since someone of his status was willing to take a dirt-stained woman like her as his wife. Marion stared at him coldly and replied that she never asked for any of it. If he preferred a traditionally feminine girl, then she would be glad if he looked elsewhere. Dean stared at her for a moment longer before turning and walking away. Once he was out of sight, Haruchika looked at Marion and asked what that wife comment had been about. Marion informed him that Dean was technically her fiancé. Haruchika was stunned by the revelation. Marion explained that Dean was strong, and in the Bonnet family, strength was everything. Before she even realized it, their families had arranged the engagement without consulting her. She went on to say that the only thing left was a battle. If he could prove he was stronger than her, the engagement would be finalized. But she didn't want to get married. She wanted to become a knight, so she had refused to fight, knowing full well she was only delaying the inevitable. Haruchika looked at her seriously and asked if even she couldn't win against him. That question hit a nerve. Marion grew furious and pointed a finger at him, snapping that even if he was an amateur, she could defeat him easily just by watching. At that moment, Haruchika heard a strange sound that pulled his attention away. His eyes widened as he noticed that Marion's romance value was dropping and falling into the negatives. But finally, it all clicked. He had figured out how it actually worked. The next morning, Marion entered the school with a scowl on her face. She sat down beside Haruchika without even sparing him a glance, let alone a word. He greeted her with a casual good morning, but she ignored him and walked away. Standing behind Haruchika was visibly anxious. She leaned in and asked what they were going to do, since Marion's values were now in the negatives and her affection rating had plummeted drastically. Haruchika told her to shut up, still deep in thought about everything that had happened the day before. Moments later, Haruchika and Marion stood facing each other on the training grounds, swords in hand. He repeated her own words back to her that she didn't want to fight because she didn't want to get married, and then asked if this was the same as forfeiting. Marion snapped back that it wasn't and insisted that she hadn't lost. Haruchika laughed and said that since the families had already arranged everything, if she didn't want to be labeled a forfeit loser, she might as well fight and lose now. He mocked her further, suggesting that getting married, having kids, and starting a family might not be such a bad life after all. That was when she grabbed him by the collar, furious. She shouted that she wanted to become a knight. and that the idea of marriage and children was ridiculous. She added that if she ever had to do something as disgusting as that, she would rather die on the spot. Haruchika realized then that she had absolutely no romantic feelings, and it made sense because being forced into marriage and motherhood when she wasn't even interested would naturally push anyone into that kind of emotional state. Around them, the other students had started watching. Some commented that the transfer student was getting roughed up pretty badly. Mary heard the whispers and immediately let go of Haruchika, her face turning red with frustration. Her romance value dropped even further into the negatives. Later, Chika sat at a table, lost in his thoughts, when Jibril interrupted him again. She was panicking, reporting that Marian's value had dropped another 10 points from yesterday's -40. She guessed that Marian must have stewed over the incident all night and grown even angrier. Grabbing Haruchika by the shoulder, she asked him what he was going to do now that Marian completely hated him. Haruchika simply smirked and said that everything was fine, and there was no problem at all. He gently pushed Jibril's cheek to the side to move her away, and confidently declared that they were still moving straight toward the goal. Sitting alone with his arms folded, he closed his eyes and thought calmly to himself that falling in love always happens in an instant. Marian was still sitting with a scowl on her face, her romance value having dropped to -99. She noticed Haruchika staring at her and snapped at him to stop looking her way. He replied that he wasn't looking at her and accused her of being paranoid. Internally, he thought that it didn't seem like the value could go any lower than -99. Jibril, clearly anxious, muttered that this wasn't just dislike anymore, rather it was practically murderous intent. Haruchika calmly told her not to worry and said that everything was ready. All that remained was the right opportunity. Jibril blinked in confusion, unsure of what he meant, but before she could ask, they both noticed Dean approaching. Haruchika smirked and told her that he had set everything up. Dean, clearly furious, gritted his teeth and slammed an envelope down on the table in front of him. Haruchika glanced at it and asked what the meaning of this was. Dean announced that it was a duel challenge. Marian, noticing the scene unfolding, walked over to them. Haruchika commented aloud that Marian's family wanted her to marry the strongest man, but he didn't think he was that person. Marian's eyes widened in anger, and she demanded to know why he was getting involved in something that had nothing to do with him, calling his actions annoying. Dean laughed and asked if Haruchika had fallen for Marian, telling him he could have the mountain monkey girl. Marian glared at him, thinking to herself that she had never belonged to Dean to begin with. Dean stepped even closer to Haruchika and said he couldn't stand him claiming to be stronger. Haruchika calmly raised his head and replied that he had never asked Dean to overlook anything. Dean turned and walked away, declaring that he would teach him a lesson on a date of his choosing in 7 days. Marian's romance value immediately dropped to -100. She stood in shock, then demanded to know what kind of harassment this was. Haruchika smiled, satisfied to confirm that -99 was indeed the limit. He then looked at her and, imitating her tone, repeated her own words back that she didn't want to marry Dean, yet they kept dragging it out, so he decided to duel in her place. She slammed her hands on the table and shouted, asking what kind of logic that was. Haruchika answered that it was thoughtful. If he won, she wouldn't have to marry Dean. She stared at him in disbelief, certain that there was no way he could win. As if reading her thoughts, Haruchika added that even if he lost, she could still claim she hadn't lost herself. Marian grabbed him by the collar, furious, and growled that there were things he could say and things he absolutely shouldn't. Their classmates crowded around, whispering and asking what Haruchika had done to provoke Dean into challenging him. Haruchika turned to Marian and calmly said that if she was so upset, she could train him for the next 7 days so that he could win. Marian was stunned by the request. Training began immediately. Throughout the grueling sessions, Marian shouted at Haruchika to get up, demanding to know if he wanted her to kill him right there. Haruchika lifted his head to meet her eyes and reminded her that the duel rules stated that if he ran away or couldn't fight, he would automatically lose. Marian groaned in frustration and muttered that he really was the worst, then reminded him they only had 1 week. She bent down to meet his eyes and growled that if he lost, she would kill him herself. Haruchika groaned and clutched his head, pleading with her to go easy on him. 2 days later, they were still training relentlessly. Haruchika sat on the ground, exhausted, when Marian ordered him to get up and stop resting. She mocked him, questioning whether he still thought he could win. Haruchika wasn't surprised by her behavior, not at a romance level of -100. He understood that she had no mercy for the person she hated most, but that was fine because he had been hated throughout middle school too. Jibril, the tiny fairy, started mumbling something melancholic when he snapped at her to shut up and stop reading his mind. Marian, focused and serious, reminded him that there was no time to rest. If there was any chance of winning, it was with the first strike, when McAllister might be caught off guard. She shouted at him to increase the initial speed of his thrusts. Haruchika reminded himself that he would do anything to return to his original world, and it didn't seem like there were any cheat items or shortcuts for guaranteed victory. Jibril apologized, admitting that this was beyond her expertise. He muttered that winning wasn't even the real goal for him. Jibril was puzzled by his words, but before she could ask, Marian yelled again for Haruchika to resume his swings. 6 days passed quickly, and the promised week had finally arrived. Haruchika had poured all his effort into the training, refusing to cut corners. Meanwhile, Marian was at her Bonate family mansion, resting and bathing while thinking about the match ahead. She realized that if he lost, she wouldn't be able to make excuses to her father, and the thought made her furious that she imagined killing Haruchika herself. Her mind went back to a recent conversation with her father, where he mentioned hearing about the duel and deciding to come watch it. She knew the training had been brutal, but she had endured it, and was surprised to find she had more guts than she thought. After changing into her clothes, she sat by the window and quietly resolved to face whatever was going to happen. The day of the match finally arrived. A huge crowd had gathered, buzzing with excitement and cheering loudly. Some commented that it had been a long time since McAllister's last match. Dean walked up to Haruchika and Marian and arrogantly told them to be grateful he was willing to entertain such a foolish charade. Marian replied with a sarcastic thank you. Haruchika knew he didn't need to win, but he needed to fight with the intention of winning, or it would all be meaningless. The referee stepped forward and announced that the arena was reinforced with magic to reduce the damage from lethal attacks. The match would end when one of them landed a potentially lethal blow. Haruchika and Dean nodded, confirming that they understood the rules. The referee signaled the start of the match. Haruchika stepped forward with determination, knowing this was the most critical moment. Marian watched with growing interest. Haruchika launched an attack, and though Dean managed to deflect it, a small trail of blood trickled from his finger. The sight enraged Dean, who surged forward with a counterattack. He struck Haruchika, sending him crashing face first into the ground with a heavy thud. Dean grinned, declaring that he would finish this in one strike, but then changed his mind, deciding not to end it so easily. Haruchika pushed himself up using his sword for support, urging himself to stay conscious. He grinned back at Dean, further provoking him. Dean lunged again with his sword, and Haruchika knew that one solid hit could finish him, but he also knew that the true first strike was the crucial one. The point wasn't to defeat Dean, but to provoke him, to shift the narrative. Winning or losing no longer mattered. The goal now was to make Marian regain her feelings of love. With that resolve in mind, he braced himself as the fierce battle continued.